In 1967, Japan experienced the peak of its most famous post-war film cycle, the Kaiju boom. Since 1954, Kaiju or monster films have been gaining popularity in Japan and becoming its most commercially successful cultural exports, culminating in a year in which all 5 of Japan's major studios released at least one of them. Toho Studios had Son of Godzilla and King Kong Escapes. Daiei released Gamera vs. Gyaos, the 3rd installment in their answer to Toho's Godzilla series. Shochiku released The X from Outer Space, Nikkatsu released Gappa, the Triamphibian Monsters, and Toei co-produced Yongari, Monster from the Deep, with South Korea's Kyokdong Entertainment. 50 years later, in 2017, 3 films that drew inspiration from Japan's kaiju films were released in the United States within a month of each other. The first, Legendary Pictures' Kong Skull Island, was released March 10th, setting up a shared cinematic universe with 2014's Godzilla reboot. The second, Power Rangers, was released March 24th, followed by the April 7th wide release of Nacho Vigalando's independent Colossal, starring Anne Hathaway. These films were part of an ongoing, emerging cycle of Hollywood films based on the Japanese kaiju genre, beginning in the late 2000s and continuing throughout the 2010s. Starting from 2008's Cloverfield and counting up through the upcoming Godzilla vs. Kong in 2020, this American kaiju boom is set to include at least 10 films so far. That's not exactly a phenomenon on the scale of superhero movies, but 50 to 60-year-old foreign genres suddenly striking such a chord with American audiences does beg the questions, why this and why now? I would argue that both the original Japanese kaiju films and their American counterparts acknowledge and articulate similar cultural anxieties regarding politics, war, economics, and national identity. This might sound like overthinking things at first. The surface appeal of stories about giant monsters is fairly obvious, and indeed plenty of critics seem to assume that that's all there is to these movies. But these themes are part of what gives the kaiju genre a distinct identity. To start with, let's take a look at how the genre began and how it developed from there. World War II was an event so unprecedented and cataclysmic that it completely redefined politics, culture, and media in many parts of the world. Even where no great destruction had occurred, the mental toll the war took on those who had fought in it followed them home, changing the way they related to the society around them. Nicholas Christopher notes that American soldiers returning from abroad were under great pressure to reacclimate themselves, to turn off the black energy that enabled them to survive the war as if they were turning off a faucet, and that the trauma of these buried experiences and the changed society to which they returned produced the paranoid, neurotic world of film noir. This is the effect that World War II had on the cinema of the United States, which suffered only one major attack on its territory and ultimately emerged from the war victorious and an industrial superpower, gaining control over numerous new foreign territories to boot. Japan, to put it mildly, was not nearly so lucky. Their surrender came on the heels of the firebombing of their capital and the devastation of 2 other cities by the atomic bomb, with conservative estimates placing the civilian death toll alone at over 500,000 people. For nearly a decade following the surrender, Japan would be occupied by the US military, while the US restructured its government and economy, as well as censoring its media. The whole of Japanese society and politics was reshaped by a foreign power, the same one to which Japan had lost much of its earlier empire, and they were unable to openly discuss the effects of this experience for years. After the end of the occupation and a handful of tentative, sentimental treatments of the atomic bombings in 1952 and 53, the raw cinematic expression of Japan's wartime and post-war trauma, Japan's film noir, would be unleashed in 1954's Godzilla. Godzilla originated as a last-minute replacement for a film called In the Shadow of Glory, a planned co-production between Toho Studios and Indonesia's Perfini that would have been shot on location in Indonesia. As Japanese-Indonesian relations deteriorated, Perfini backed out, leaving Toho with a major gap in their release schedule. A month earlier, in March 1954, the Japanese fishing boat Daigo Fukuryu Maru, Lucky Dragon No. 5, had been showered with radioactive ash, fallout from the US's Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb test at Bikini Atoll. The entire crew developed acute radiation sickness and 1 man died, sparking a wave of renewed anxiety about nuclear weapons and radiation. With these events in mind, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka hit upon the idea of a film about a giant monster awakened by atomic testing, and the result, released that November, combined these current events with the scars left by the war, the bomb, and the occupation to create a complex film that not only became the hit Toho needed it to be, but resonated so strongly with audiences that its influence on Japanese culture would be felt more than half a century later. Godzilla introduced a number of themes that would recur throughout the larger kaiju genre it spawned. The first, and best known, is its commentary on nuclear weapons. Godzilla is explicitly tied to the atomic bomb. The film's lead scientist, Dr. Yamane, explains to the Diet, Japan's parliament, that large amounts of the isotope strontium-90 are found in Godzilla's wake, suggesting it was exposed to hydrogen bomb tests. The texture of its skin, though not mentioned in the film, bears some resemblance to the keloid scars developed by people burned by the atomic explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ruins of Tokyo after Godzilla's Rampage resemble the cities destroyed by the bomb, and the scenes of overcrowded hospitals full of irradiated, dying people recalled the bombings as well. The Lucky Dragon incident is referenced numerous times. The film's opening scene depicts a fishing boat sinking following a blinding flash of light. The Lucky Dragon had been close enough to the Castle Bravo test to see the flash. One fisherman from Odo Island, whose mythology provides Godzilla's name, survives one of the shipwrecks caused by Godzilla, only to be killed when it comes ashore a few days later, mirroring the fate of the Lucky Dragon radio man Aikichi Kuboyama, who succumbed to radiation sickness after the ship returned to Japan, as well as those who survived the initial explosions at the end of the war, but later died from exposure to fallout. A woman on a train in one scene mentions the scare about contaminated tuna that followed the incident, lamenting the fact that she survived Nagasaki only to be threatened by Godzilla, while her friends bemoan having to return to shelters as they did during the war. The most common interpretation of these elements is to regard Godzilla itself as a metaphor for the atomic bomb. And while this is not incorrect, the function of Godzilla in the film is more complicated. Unlike most monster films before or since, the original Godzilla agonizes at great length over whether to kill its monster. Dr. Yamane is deeply upset by the military's insistence on destroying Godzilla, preferring to learn from it as a fellow victim and survivor of nuclear bombies.
山根博士、率直に申し上げます。いかにしたらゴジラの生命を絶つことができるか、その対策を伺いたいんです。
それは無理です。水爆の洗礼を受けながらも、なおかつ生命を保っているゴジラを何をもって抹殺しようというのですか。そんなことよりも、まずあの不思議な生命力を研究することこそ第一の急務です。
Yamane wasn't alone. Audiences sympathized with Godzilla as well, even as it once again unleashed the horror of nuclear destruction on Japan. Scholar Mark Anderson notes that it was only around the time of Godzilla's release that Japan could properly mourn what it had lost in the war, after the end of the occupation, by which time Japan's campaigns in Asia and the Pacific had been recast as war crimes. He cites the result as an example of the Freudian idea of melancholy, a form of mourning in which the mourner attacks themselves. David Khaled addresses this response eloquently in his audio commentary for the film, citing reports that the cast and crew were moved to tears by Godzilla's death when the finished film was screened.
On one hand, you side with your country and grieve as it suffers, and on the other, you feel a personal allegiance that defies patriotism. You want to attack your country, scream in its face for leading you into a stupid war. This movie offered Japanese audiences a cathartic experience of projecting themselves into the role of the thing that was doing the attacking, not being attacked. They're cheering on the destruction of the outward symbols of Japanese prosperity and modernization, the trappings of economic success, the buildings where their so-called leaders ruled.
Indeed, Godzilla also contains some hints of anxiety over Japan's national identity and the changes to its society and economy after the war. As Khaled mentioned, Godzilla attacks several symbols of Japan's westernization and the new liberal democratic capitalist system set up by the US occupation. It is depicted destroying a significant portion of Tokyo's Ginza shopping district, including the Matsuzakaya and Wako department stores, as well as the Nichigeki Theater, a popular destination for American GIs during the occupation. Other prominent targets include the Diet Building and the Television Broadcasting Tower. Japanese critic Inohiko Yomota describes an esoteric interpretation that points out Godzilla's path through Tokyo spares the Imperial Palace, suggesting that it represents the souls of the Japanese soldiers killed in the war, seeking revenge on Japan for surrendering and selling out to the West. The film also appears to express doubts about Japan's relationship with the US. Japan notably faces Godzilla alone, possibly reflecting contemporary anxieties over the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security, which required Japan to contribute to the cost of maintaining the US's local military bases and placed severe restrictions on the new Japan Self-Defense Forces without a guarantee of US military protection. The role of Japan's military is another issue addressed in the film's subtext. While the scenes of military-directed mass evacuations would have recalled the Tokyo firebombings, Godzilla's depiction of Japan's self-defense forces guiding people out of the city and working quickly to erect an enormous electrified fence as a protective barrier around Tokyo Bay was also part of a post-war healing process. To quote Khaled again,
there was still a problem in how movies could depict Japanese soldiers. There wasn't much you could do that would be set in the present. The new Japanese constitution placed strict limits of what the real-life military could do. They could defend the country from invasion, and that was about it. If you set your film in World War II, it meant your soldier characters were on the losing side of a conflict that you were now obliged to depict as deeply wrong. So a film like this created a unique opportunity to show the contemporary Japanese military doing heroic and resourceful things now in the present in a way that the audience could cheer for without any lingering traces of guilt.
There's also the reclusive Dr. Serizawa, a disfigured war veteran whose research accidentally produces the oxygen destroyer, a chemical compound that asphyxiates and liquefies living things in water. Terrified of his discovery's destructive power, Serizawa is forced to decide between keeping his invention a secret lest it become another weapon of war like the H-bomb, or allowing it to be used against Godzilla, saving Japan from a clear and present threat.
人間というものは弱いもんだよ。一切の書類を焼いたとしても、俺の頭の中には残っている。俺が死なない限り、どんなことで再び使用する立場に追い込まれないと誰が断言できる。ああ、こんなものさえ作らなきゃ。
He ultimately makes his findings public and successfully uses it to kill Godzilla, but only after destroying his notes and finally committing suicide, keeping the oxygen destroyer out of the hands of the world's armies by dying with Godzilla. In Serizawa, one can see a struggle for Japan to find its place amidst the escalating nuclear arms race. The original Godzilla's anti-war message was informed in no small part by the experiences of co-writer and director Ishiro Honda, who would go on to direct many more of Toho's sci-fi and monster films, including many of the classic Godzilla films of the 1960s. In 1934, Honda had just begun his filmmaking career at Photographic Chemical Laboratories, or PCL, when he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army, receiving the call up to active duty in 1935. In 1936, a former commanding officer of his, Yasuhide Kurihara, made a failed attempt at a coup against the Prime Minister. Despite Honda's lack of involvement, his regiment was unofficially held accountable for the event and transferred from Tokyo to Manchuria. After his first tour, Honda himself would be called back to active duty twice more during the war. Once in 1939, shortly after his marriage and the birth of his first child, and again in 1944. Honda did not support the war. He and Akira Kurosawa confided their reservations about Japan's militarism to each other while working as assistant directors at PCL, sentiments that would grow deeper during Honda's second tour when he was assigned to manage a comfort station, the common euphemism for the military-operated brothels in territories occupied by Japan. In China, Honda was mortified by the brutality of the Japanese army. Back home, Toho, the product of a merger between PCL and another studio, was subjected to a Nazi-inspired censorship code and forced to produce war propaganda for the government. During his final tour of duty, Honda narrowly avoided death when a shell launched by the Chinese resistance landed at his feet and failed to explode. Honda later retrieved the shell and kept it while spending the last year of the war as a prisoner of the Chinese National Revolutionary Army, later taking it home as a reminder of the horrors of war. These experiences left a lasting impact on Honda, and would influence both the somber tone and plea for disarmament in the original Godzilla, and the strong hope for international cooperation expressed in his later work. Indeed, most of these key themes would recur throughout the kaiju genre in the years and decades that followed, both in Honda's films and in others. Nuclear testing would be addressed repeatedly, such as in 1961's Mothra, in which the fictional western country of Rolisica has conducted bomb tests on Infant Island despite the presence of a native population. This is developed further in 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla, in which the protagonists witnessed the destroyed ecosystem of Infant Island on their way to plead with the natives for Mothra's help against Godzilla. An unusually direct reference to the World War II bombings takes place in 1965's Frankenstein Conquers the World, in which the still-beating heart of Frankenstein's monster is seized by the Nazis and given to the Japanese military for research into creating indestructible soldiers during the last days of the war. The heart is being studied at an army hospital in Hiroshima when the bomb is dropped. 15 years later, American scientist Dr. James Bowen is working with patients suffering from the effects of radiation when a feral child, which grew from the irradiated heart of Frankenstein, appears and begins growing to a giant size. That same year, in the first installment of Daiei's Gamera series, the titular monster is released from the Arctic ice when the US Air Force shoots down an unidentified spy plane whose nuclear payload detonates when it crashes. The villains of the following year's Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster are the Red Bamboo, a paramilitary organization of unknown nationality who are using slave labor from Infant Island to maintain facilities where they're attempting to manufacture nuclear weapons. 1967's King Kong Escapes has Madame Piranha, an agent of an unnamed country, bankrolling the evil Doctor Who's robot Mechanicong, and mind control of the original Kong in order to mine the rare element X, which can be used to create nuclear weapons more powerful than those possessed by the US or the Soviet Union. Themes of Japan's national identity and its role in World War II are at the center of 1963's Atragon, in which the Atlantis-like lost continent of Mu attempts to take over Earth's surface. The protagonists must appeal to Captain Jinguji, whose men held out on a small Pacific island after the Japanese surrender, and have constructed the Atragon, a futuristic submarine that could turn the tide against Mu. Jinguji, however, refuses, stating that the Atragon was created for the express purpose of restoring the Japanese Empire. Jinguji was a clear reference to real contemporary events. There was a very real resurgence of right-wing Japanese nationalism at the time, and some Japanese soldiers had in fact held out in the Pacific after the war, isolated, unchanging, eventually returning home still professing loyalty to values largely abandoned since the 1940s.
神宮寺は日本海軍のために海底軍艦を建造したのです。世界は変わったんだ。だから海底軍艦でまた変えます。あなたは愛国心という錆びついた鎧をつけている亡霊です。亡霊だと?
The film offers a round condemnation of these ideals, and Jinguji is eventually persuaded to use Atragon for the good of all humanity. Mu itself is presented as a mirroring wartime Japan, so fanatically devoted to its expansionist program that in the end, as the underwater civilization is destroyed, the Empress leaps into the sea to die with it rather than acquiesce to defeat. This film was the most explicit expression of Ishiro Honda's anti-nationalism, which later manifested as optimistic portrayals of international cooperation led by the United Nations. In 1965, Invasion of Astro Monster depicted a joint mission by astronauts Fuji and Glenn to explore the newly discovered Planet X, in which Fuji plants the flags of the US, Japan, and the UN on the planet's surface. While 1968's Destroy All Monsters, set in far-off 1999, the UN plays a leading role in the containment of Earth's monsters on a Pacific island, the colonization of the Moon, and Earth's resistance to the invasion of aliens from the planet Keelok. Kaiju films also frequently critiqued the Western-style capitalist economy set up by the US after the war, with greedy businessmen frequently appearing as villains who bring about the monsters' destructive rampages. In Mothra, two small fairies from Infant Island are abducted by Rolisican entrepreneur Clark Nelson and made to perform on stage. The fairies' song is actually a prayer to Mothra, who soon comes looking for them, but Nelson persistently refuses to release the fairies, preferring to keep exploiting them even as Mothra devastates Tokyo and Rolisica's Newkirk City in her efforts to rescue them. 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla combines the kaiju film with the then-popular salaryman comedy genre, as a pharmaceutical executive arranges the capture of King Kong from Faro Island in a publicity stunt to boost the ratings of the television program his company sponsors, resulting in Kong escaping and running wild in Japan. The film also lampoons mass media and its own promotional campaign, with characters hyping up and betting on the confrontation between Kong and Godzilla as if it were a wrestling match.
新聞、ラジオ、テレビ、週刊誌、みんなゴジラ、ゴジラ、ゴジラ、ゴジラ。映画もです。
キングコングはゴジラにシャッポを脱いじゃったんですか？
まだわからんよ。じゃあやりますか2回戦。キングコングに聞いてみるんだね。おい、君と家族疎開させたか？
いや、どっかあんなとこねえかな。
Mothra vs. Godzilla had promoters Kumiyama and Torahata seize Mothra's egg when it washes up in Japan after a typhoon sweeps it away from Infant Island. The Twin Fairies request its return to prevent the larva inside from causing destruction after it hatches, but Kumiyama and Torahata refuse, planning to turn the egg into a tourist attraction. Gappa the Triphibian Monsters features a similar plot, in which a magazine publisher has a baby monster captured from a Pacific island, only for its parents to follow it to Japan and go on a rampage searching for it. These themes would continue to turn up even as the genre became lighter and began to directly target children. 1969's All Monsters Attack centers on a lonely latchkey kid named Ichiro, whose working-class parents are rarely around in the evenings, leaving him on his own. Tormented by a gang of bullies, Ichiro dreams about escaping to Monster Island, where he befriends Godzilla's son Minya and watches monster battles. Godzilla teaches Minya to stand up to the monster Gabara, lessons that Ichiro uses to escape when he's abducted by bank robbers hiding out in an abandoned building near his family's apartment. Though best remembered for its campy Monster Island sequences, in which budget cuts forced the filmmakers to reuse numerous monster battles from previous films, the film also paints a bleak picture of the problems facing poor families. Ichiro's left on his own in a dangerous industrial zone with little to do but explore empty factories. The morning after Ichiro's escape from the bank robbers, his mother promises to work less so she can be around more, but Ichiro reassures her.
ごめんね。これからお母さん、どんなことがあっても夜は働かないわ。
うん。でも生活厳しいんだろ？
まあ。
そりゃお父さんやお母さんがいつもいた方がいいけど、僕だって一人で大丈夫だよ。ごちそうさま。はい。行ってきます。
行ってらっしゃい。気をつけてね。
The shot lingers for several seconds after Ichiro leaves for school as his mother begins to cry, realizing he's right. She and Ichiro's father have no choice but to work late. David Collett notes that what was known as Japan's post-war economic miracle was well underway at this point, making even this children's film an examination of the human cost of Japan's new prosperity. The following year, Space Amoeba would raise the issue of the legacy of Japan's participation in World War II, with the Japanese protagonists being regarded with suspicion by the natives of an island occupied by the Imperial Japanese Army during the war, and later joining with the natives to fight off monsters using munitions left behind after the Japanese retreat. 1973's Godzilla vs. Megalon, an otherwise straightforward children's film, drew inspiration from recent controversies over nuclear testing.
The nuclear test at the beginning of the film seems to be a reference to Kanakin, which was the code name for the explosion of a 5-megaton hydrogen bomb at Amchitka in the Aleutian Islands chain of Alaska in November 1971. It was the largest underground nuclear test ever performed by the United States, and Greenpeace was actually founded as a protest group that tried to stop this test. Scientists had predicted that the test was so big it would cause tsunamis and earthquakes and other disasters, much like what you see here in the movie, but ultimately those things didn't happen.
Japan's war crimes would be revisited even as late as 2001 in Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, in which Godzilla is the embodiment of all the Japanese and foreign soldiers killed in China, Korea, and the Pacific, returning to punish Japan for burying and forgetting its misdeeds. Even as decades passed and the genre expanded beyond its roots, Joyce E. Boss suggests that kaiju remained a reiteration of the trickster archetype, a type of character and folklore from cultures around the world that transgresses boundaries and taboos, identifying sites of tension and contradiction in society and culture. These films were all released in the United States, either theatrically or on television, at most a few years after their release in Japan. Though the works of auteurs like Akira Kurosawa were more critically renowned, they were largely confined to niche channels of distribution like college campuses and art houses, while kaiju films were everywhere, achieving commercial success in mainstream theaters and becoming staples of late-night television. These films became embedded in the American popular consciousness. Even somebody who's never seen a Godzilla movie probably at least recognizes the name. So why didn't a wave of American imitators follow immediately in the 50s and 60s? Simply put, while Japanese monster films could certainly appeal to American audiences, Americans related to monsters and to the themes addressed in kaiju films differently. Japanese and American viewers alike enjoyed these films but brought different sensibilities and experiences to bear in understanding them. This affected not only the film's reception, but the presentation as well. When the original Godzilla was imported to the US, it found its way into the hands of a small production company called Jewel Enterprises, who radically altered the film for the American market. New scenes were shot featuring Raymond Burr as American reporter Steve Martin, who stumbles across the developing crisis in Japan and covers it for a Chicago newspaper, using his connections to the original film's main characters. Martin is inserted as an observer in many scenes, with a Japanese interpreter explaining things to him and the audience, saving Jewel Enterprises the trouble of dubbing many scenes. In other scenes, he converses directly with the original cast, portrayed through a combination of body doubles and dubbed talking headshots.
If I could only see him, just talk to him.
Perhaps I can change his mind. Ogata will go with me.
Whatever you do, Emiko, you mustn't fail.
Despite the addition of new footage to numerous existing scenes, as well as several entirely new scenes, the US cut, titled Godzilla King of the Monsters, ran 16 minutes shorter than the original film. This meant that between 30 and 40 minutes of the Japanese cut were omitted, including all explicit references to World War II and nuclear weapons, save for Godzilla leaving radiation in its wake and Dr. Yamane proposing that Godzilla was awakened and mutated by the hydrogen bomb. What remained of the original subtext would be largely unintelligible to American viewers, effectively reducing the film's commentary on nuclear weapons to a plot device that explains the monster, and sparing American viewers the film's meditation on the Japanese experience of the war and the bomb. To complete the film's Americanization, the story was restructured so that Raymond Burr narrated the film mostly in flashback, taking advantage of the dark, moody visual style to effectively transform it into a film noir of sorts, in a sense swapping Japanese wartime trauma for the American equivalent. Sayuri Guthrie Shimizu explains the difference in attitudes towards nuclear war that informed these changes. For the Japanese, the devastation caused by nuclear weapons was already part of the national collective memory, a real tragedy from which they had had to recover. For the Americans, it was a hypothetical scenario, terrifying but unreal and abstract, one of numerous anxieties about the prospect of war with the Soviet Union. Japan is regularly struck by earthquakes and typhoons. The atom bomb was, in some ways, regarded as a new form of the kind of catastrophic destruction with which the Japanese were already intimately familiar, and as a result, depictions of kaiju often give their rampages the inexorable qualities of natural disasters. America, on the other hand, had sensationalized fears of an attack by an external enemy, and this was reflected in the advertising for Godzilla King of the Monsters as a straightforward sci-fi disaster film, with taglines and trailers hyping up the spectacle of destruction like a carnival barker.
Godzilla, King of the Monsters, it's alive! A gigantic beast, stalking the earth, crushing all before it. In a cyclonic cavalcade of electrifying horror, wiping out a city of 6 million in a holocaust of flame. Dynamic violence, savage action, spectacular thrills. Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
This set a precedent for how kaiju films would be presented and received in the United States. They were generally treated as exploitation films, released as B-pictures by major studios, or handled by distributors like American International Pictures, whose other specialties included teen beach party films and a series of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations by a young Roger Corman. Kaiju films were marketed and viewed similarly to domestic monster movies, meaning that their particular style and themes had little impact on contemporary American monster films. There was, however, a precursor to the eventual American adaptations of the genre, 1967's Yongari Monster from the Deep. While it was made with financial support and a special effects crew provided by Japan's Toei Studios, the film was produced and set in South Korea, another country with serious wartime traumas and identity crises to work through. Korea was freed from Japanese colonial rule after 35 years at the end of World War II. After negotiations between the Allied powers to set up a single Korean government failed, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was established in the north and the Republic of Korea in the south. Regarding the latter and its authoritarian anti-communist leader Syngman Rhee as illegitimate Western puppets, Northern leader Kim Il-sung sent the Korean People's Army to reunify Korea under his government. US-led forces retaliated, pushing the KPA back north until the People's Republic of China sent heavy reinforcements. Korea, in the end, remained divided along more or less the same line as it had been before, with nearly every major Korean city on either side of the border destroyed by US forces and millions of Korean civilians dead. South Korea underwent a series of upheavals and coups following a student revolt that forced Syngman Rhee's resignation, and by the time of Yongari's production, the presidency was held by Park Chung-hee, ostensibly a civilian leader who had been part of the military junta that preceded him. Yongari, while overall a far more lighthearted film than the original Godzilla, dealt similarly with the effects of all this turmoil, as explained by Steve Reifel and Korean film historian Kim Song-ho. In contrast to the actual state of the nation, which more resembled a third world country than the world economic power of today, Yongari presents an aspirational vision of a modern, highly developed South Korea, with its own space program and self-reliant military. It presents a conflicted view of cultural and economic westernization, a modernizing force that had come at the cost of enormous class disparities and brutal political repression. The film's elite protagonists, among them astronauts, government officials, and scientists, wear Western clothes symbolizing Korean progress in the country's future. However, as Yongari approaches Seoul and the population is evacuated, rich businessmen continue to gorge themselves on food, dismissively tossing money at a concerned waiter, while young people obliviously dance to rock music and get drunk in a nightclub. Yongari itself is first awakened by a nuclear test, reflecting anxieties about the Cold War that now defined the political state of Korea, and first emerges from underground at Panmunjom, the site of the armistice agreement that established the present ceasefire between North and South Korea, tying the monster to fears of a return to war. Yongari also destroys a building that bears a strong resemblance to both Japan's Diet Building, recalling a scene from the original Godzilla, and the headquarters of the former Japanese colonial government in Seoul. Korea's tumultuous history and wartime devastation to an extent paralleled Japan's, making a Korean adaptation of the Japanese kaiju genre that dealt with these issues particularly apt. It makes sense then that the context for the sudden boom in kaiju-based US productions would include significant doubts about America's national identity, its role in the world, and the economic and political system on which its society was founded. The 9/11 terrorist attacks sent profound shocks through the American collective consciousness, and the US government's response called into question its image as self-styled defenders of freedom and the history of intervention in the Middle East that led to the attacks. As more and more people came to believe past and present military intervention was an attempt to maintain American economic dominance and access to the region's oil, economic crises and the ascendancy of China threatened America's position as a largely unrivaled superpower following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the gradual mainstreaming of geek culture and cult media from the late 2000s through the new teens brought a greater cultural awareness and understanding of kaiju films as a distinct genre and of the themes they dealt with. As niche media became more visible in mainstream pop culture, filmmakers and studios came to consider it more viable as the basis for new films. And while America's 21st century insecurity was no atomic bombing or Korean War, its effects on the collective psyche of the US turned out to be perfect material for kaiju films to explore. I would point to 2008's Cloverfield as the first film that this confluence of circumstances produced, While Peter Jackson's King Kong remake from 2005 was an earlier example of a major post-9/11 American giant monster movie, Cloverfield was the first significantly informed by Japanese kaiju films and contemporary social and political issues. The film itself purports to be the contents of a camcorder tape recovered in New York City by the US military, considered valuable for its extensive documentation of an event codenamed Cloverfield. The tape begins with childhood friends Rob and Beth waking up together following a spontaneous sexual encounter and deciding to go to Coney Island. The film then jumps forward about a month as the remainder of the tape's contents are recorded over the ensuing trip. Rob's brother Jason, his girlfriend Lily, and their friend Hud are throwing a surprise party for Rob as a send-off before he leaves the country to take an executive position at a Japanese company. Hud is tasked with taking video of the party and gathering testimonials from the attendees. Beth shows up, having had almost no contact with Rob in the meantime, with a new boyfriend in tow, which upsets Rob and leads to Beth leaving the party early. Shortly thereafter, a tremor shakes the apartment, and it quickly becomes apparent that a giant creature is wreaking havoc in the city. After a failed attempt to evacuate in which Jason is killed, Rob receives a call for help from Beth, who is trapped in her apartment. He, Lily, Hud, and a partygoer named Marlena set off on a mission to reach her, rescue her, and escape the city, which brings them into contact with the creature, a species of giant skin parasites that it carried ashore, and the military personnel fighting a losing battle against both. Cloverfield is in part one long allusion to the 9/11 attacks. In the initial confusion as the creature's attack begins, characters suspect another terrorist attack.
What do you think? I think it's another terrorist attack.
It's insane, man.
It's shaking everywhere, man. It's like tremors.
Yeah, it's on the news downstairs.
So is this the only life that went out?
No, a couple did. Some stayed on.
The found footage aesthetic and several images throughout, such as people fleeing a billowing dust cloud from a collapsing building, and loose pieces of paper floating through the air in the aftermath, draw directly on home videos of the World Trade Center attacks. The military's response to the situation can be taken as a metaphor for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, as they respond to a seemingly unwinnable battle with increasingly drastic and destructive measures.
Do you guys know what it is out there? Do you know what that thing is?
No, they ain't telling me. Whatever it is, it's winning. The government's considering the hammer down protocol, which means they're willing to let this whole area go.
You mean Midtown?
No, I mean Manhattan. Come on.
The film doesn't show the results of this response, but a hidden message in the end credits suggests it's unsuccessful. However, the film itself only tells part of the story. Producer J.J. Abrams, executive producer of the famously cryptic TV series Lost, created a viral marketing campaign in the form of an elaborate alternate reality game, featuring websites for in-universe companies and organizations, social media accounts for the individuals involved, phone numbers, news videos, merchandise, physical documents, and other artifacts that allowed fans to piece together the film's backstory in the months before and after Cloverfield's release. In brief, the narrative revealed concerns the fictional Japanese conglomerate Tagurato, which operates several offshore drilling platforms through which it obtains oil and, later, a newly discovered substance that it names seabed's nectar, which is used as an addictive but seemingly harmless sweetener in Tagurato's Slusho brand of frozen drinks. However, there is evidence that the substance can produce abnormal growth and mutations if consumed, and the company uses the mining operation to covertly study deep-sea life affected by seabed's nectar released into the ocean, including the creature that eventually attacks New York. Tagurato keeps this information from the public, orchestrating the disappearances and deaths of several whistleblowers. After the creature attacks and destroys the drilling platform, Tagurato then launches a satellite to track the creature's movement under the pretext of helping the Japanese government locate pieces of one of its own satellites that broke apart. A piece of this satellite falls into the sea off New York, which Rob unwittingly captures on camera at the end of the tape of his and Beth's Coney Island outing. This debris strikes the creature, sending it into a panic and leading to the events of the film. This backstory expands on the themes apparent in the film by tying the seemingly inexplicable attack to underhanded corporate maneuvers, cover-ups, and environmental destruction going back decades. Like 9/11, the creature's attack seems to the people on the ground to come out of nowhere, but the groundwork was laid by unscrupulous and secretive powers long ago in efforts that the victims of these attacks indirectly benefit from. The American affluence, exemplified by the companies whose offices populated the World Trade Center, was built in part on the exploitation of Middle Eastern resources secured through US-backed regime change, to which 9/11 was a response. In Cloverfield, it is implied that Rob's new job in Japan is with Tagarado, making him a beneficiary of the activities that resulted in the creature's emergence in New York. Cloverfield's lack of confidence in military power to solve its problem carries over into later American kaiju films. Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim, released in 2013, takes place near the end of a long war between invading kaiju, actually referred to as such in the film, which emerge from a portal at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and the Jaegers, enormous robots controlled by two human pilots with synchronized neural activity, a connection referred to as drifting. An opening montage explains the hubris that resulted from the early successes of the Jaeger program.
We started winning. Jaegers stopping kaijus everywhere. But the Jaegers were only as good as their pilots. So Jaeger pilots turned into rock stars. Danger turned into propaganda. Kaijus into toys.
But the powerful war machine that the Jaeger program develops into is only able to keep the situation under control for so long, necessitating a new approach. Del Toro reiterates Ishiro Honda's internationalist streak, critiquing isolationism via a coastal wall construction program that emerges as an unsuccessful alternative to Jaeger combat. And the tide is finally turned by a ragtag team of American, British, Japanese, Russian, Chinese, and Australian pilots relying on the discoveries of a pair of maverick scientists in crafting a strategy to close the portal as opposed to brute military force. This theme is also reflected in the 2014 Godzilla reboot, which pits Godzilla against a mating pair of ancient, radiation-eating parasites codenamed Muto, or
Massive Unidentified Terrestrial Organism.
There are some questionable choices in the film's handling of nuclear themes compared to its source material. Godzilla and the Mutos apparently existed in their current form millions of years ago, independent of nuclear tests, and the 1954 Castle Bravo test that irradiated the Lucky Dragon is depicted in the opening credits as an attempt to kill Godzilla. But overall, the film doesn't take the risks posed by nuclear weapons lightly, nor is the military that deploys them depicted too charitably. Though the military characters are portrayed as decent people earnestly doing their best to handle an unprecedented crisis, the plan they develop to stop the monsters is foolhardy at best.
Current tracking models indicate that all three targets are converging here, San Francisco Bay. But if we rig a nuclear warhead with a shielded timer, put it on a boat and send it 20 miles out, the radiation lures the Mutos, and the Mutos lure Godzilla.
And we detonate.
The plan quickly goes awry as one of the Mutos intercepts the warheads in transit and consumes most of them, and the other later steals the remaining bomb, activated and counting down to detonation, and leaves it in the nest the two Mutos have built in the middle of San Francisco. The plan fails at all of its objectives. Godzilla kills the Mutos and returns to the sea unharmed, and all the military manages to do is narrowly avoid nuking a major American city. The protagonist is a Navy bomb disposal technician, and he doesn't even successfully defuse the bomb, but just puts it on a boat and sends it away from the city to explode at sea. The film overall portrays the US military as trying to intervene in events it can't fully control, with potentially disastrous consequences. Colossal, first screened at film festivals in 2016, is an unusual addition to the lineup as a character-driven indie drama with kaiju elements. Following a breakup with her boyfriend, unemployed alcoholic blogger Gloria returns from New York City to her small New England hometown, taking a job at a bar run by her childhood friend Oscar. Soon after, a giant monster materializes in Seoul for a few minutes before disappearing. After repeated appearances, Gloria studies news footage of the monster and realizes that its appearances and movements are linked to her own movements through a playground at a local park. After a drunken demonstration of this connection to Oscar and his friends results in civilian casualties, Oscar steps onto the playground to remove a panicking Gloria, triggering the appearance of a giant robot alongside the monster. Gloria resolves to get sober and avoid the park, but Oscar grows increasingly manipulative and jealous of Gloria's developing relationship with his friend Joel, threatening to wreak havoc on Soul if Gloria leaves or displeases him. Colossal, limited in the scope of its monster scenes by its low budget, is mostly a personal story, with the monster and robot symbolizing Gloria and Oscar's inner demons and addiction. However, Gloria's grappling with the effects of her self-absorbed lack of control on people elsewhere in the world suggests a theme of growing American consciousness of the fact that Americans' relatively affluent existence often comes at the expense of other countries. There are, however, no meditations on war or the military, since the action is mostly confined to the quiet fictional town of Mainhead, and any specific allegorical treatment one might perceive of, say, US military presence in Korea is likely unintentional, since the film was originally pitched to investors as a Godzilla movie, with Gloria making the monster appear in Tokyo until Toho's lawyers intervened. Indeed, even the interpretation I proposed was more or less ignored in the film's promotion, which instead used a pop feminist angle with taglines like "all she could do was save the world" and the hashtag "she is colossal." By contrast, Kong Skull Island, released in 2017, is an extended examination of the American public's attitudes towards war and the military. Set in the same universe as 2014's Godzilla at the end of the Vietnam War, it tells the story of an expedition to the unexplored Skull Island by scientists seeking to prove a hollow Earth theory about massive underground caverns populated by giant creatures. The team's military escort, believing the expedition to be a routine geological survey, drops explosive charges, drawing the ire of Kong, the island's guardian, and awakening the skull crawlers, threatening the balance of the island's ecosystem. Conceived as a fusion of the King Kong mythos with Vietnam War films like Apocalypse Now, Kong Skull Island reflects on the decline of US hegemony through the lens of the war's end. The commanding officer of the scientists' military escort, Colonel Packard, is disappointed by the outcome of the war, a sentiment explained in an exchange with the expedition's photographer.
It's people like you lost us support back home.
You're not actually going to blame the people without guns for losing the war, are you?
Camera's way more dangerous than a gun. And we didn't lose the war. We abandoned it.
After Kong downs his men's helicopters, he develops a Captain Ahab-like obsession with killing him, without regard for Kong's having acted defensively against an intruding outside force, or the disastrous consequences his death would have for the island's native population. Skull Island becomes a metaphor for Vietnam, invaded by American forces with little understanding of their opponents and a callous attitude towards the locals, carrying out their mission with recklessly destructive abandon. The film's conscience is Hank Marlowe, an American fighter pilot who crashed on the island during World War II, along with Japanese pilot Gunpei Ikari. After a while, the two pilots become friends and live among the natives. Marlowe diffuses hostilities between the stranded research team and the natives, and consistently advocates caution and non-interference with the island. In Marlowe, the film seems to suggest that World War II was something of an unheeded lesson, and that the aftermath was a missed opportunity to pursue a lasting peace. Power Rangers, released the same month as Kong Skull Island, is in a sense the odd film out of the bunch, being the only one that doesn't engage with any of the themes discussed so far, perhaps the exception that proves the rule. The Power Rangers franchise was from the start more of a relative of the kaiju genre than a straightforward example. The original series was a heavily edited adaptation of the Japanese Super Sentai superhero franchise, which belonged to a broader genre of special effects-based media, tokusatsu in Japanese, that was derived from early offshoots of the kaiju genre such as Ultraman. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the TV series' first iteration and the basis for the 2017 film, usually featured a monster of the week that would grow to giant size by the end of the episode, requiring the Power Rangers to pilot giant robots called Zords to defeat it, but at its core it was basically a superhero show, eschewing geopolitical allegories in favor of broad appeals to loyalty, friendship, and teamwork, with the occasional very special episode about a character's parents getting a divorce, a deaf supporting character, or the Rangers leading an environmental cleanup campaign. The film maintains a broadly similar approach, but with a more serious tone addressing contemporary concerns. The Rangers themselves are now a Breakfast Club-style group of troubled high schoolers brought together by circumstance, as opposed to the original series' wholesome group of friends. and have individual subplots dealing with heavier and more mature issues. Jason, the Red Ranger, is arrested following a senior prank, costing him his spot on the school's football team and straining his relationship with his father. Kimberly, the Pink Ranger, was involved in a cyberbullying episode in which she shared another girl's nudes. Billy, the Blue Ranger, is autistic and targeted by bullies. Trini, the Yellow Ranger, has problems with her family over her sexuality. And Zach, the Black Ranger, lives in poverty with his sick mother, who he has to take care of. The film is certainly engaging with timely, real-world issues, but its roots in the superhero genre and focus on teenagers renders it more akin to an after-school special than a politically charged disaster film. The political themes would return in a surprising way in 2018's Pacific Rim Uprising. Though the US's dominant position in world affairs was shaken somewhat by the events mentioned before, its habit of intervention in other countries has remained intact. And as the new kaiju film cycle became more and more established, it was only a matter of time before it produced a conventional militaristic blockbuster, the Top Gun to Kong Skull Island's Apocalypse Now. Between the first Pacific Rim and this film, the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps, who run the Jaeger program, have developed from a ragtag last-ditch resistance into another bloated war machine and global police force, with a recruitment program actively targeting teenagers. Where the first film would have examined the ethical ramifications of this, Uprising has a handful of brief lines that could be construed as a token criticism.
But come on, she's just a kid. So were we. That's the point. You make stronger connections when you're young, and that kind of bond makes for a better drift pilot.
Yeah, I remember the pitch. Thanks.
Before forgetting all about it in time for these child soldiers to participate in a huge climactic battle in Tokyo. Guillermo del Toro purposely avoided what he called the car commercial aesthetics or the army recruitment video aesthetics in the first Pacific Rim. It is difficult to imagine a more concise description of the visual style director Stephen S. DeKnight gives Pacific Rim Uprising, which gives the sleek new Jaegers a glamorous, futuristic sheen, and during one battle preparation sequence, altogether stops looking like a movie and starts looking like an Army Strong ad. A major subplot concerns one of the first film's scientists, Newt Geisler, being afflicted with a telepathic link to the alien species that sent the kaiju to attack Earth, which they exploit to win him over and get him to pave the way for their second invasion. After this is revealed, his friend and colleague Herman Gottlieb briefly entertains the idea of trying to help him, but this is, again, quickly forgotten as the rest of the film treats him as a camp supervillain. Where the first film stressed the joint efforts of the scientists and Jaeger pilots from all over the world working together to overcome the kaiju invasion, Uprising has a square-jawed Jaeger pilot triumphantly just punch out Newt. The film closes with Newt imprisoned and protagonist Jake Pentecost stepping in to tell him this.
Nah. Good things in your head. The precursors. Tell them we're not afraid. Tell them next time they won't need to worry about coming for us. Because we're gonna come for them.
The sequel to a film about redemption, compassion, international solidarity, and cooperation for the good of all humankind ends with a former protagonist denied any chance of redemption and seemingly tied up in a basement on the receiving end of war on terror-esque threats to invade the aliens' homeworld. There's really no simpler and more elegant demonstration of how Uprising abandons the message of the first Pacific Rim. Finally, released just under a month later, there's Rampage. Like Power Rangers, Rampage is an extra degree of separation from the original kaiju films on account of its source material, an American video game series that began in the 1980s. It's also a very tightly constructed film, rarely stopping to do or say anything that doesn't keep the plot moving. The only explicit commentary it provides on a specific issue is when the protagonist, primatologist Davis Okoye, discusses the poaching of endangered animals in Africa as an explanation of his history with and relationship to George, the now mutated albino gorilla. It does, however, lean on certain ideas implicitly to move the story along. The chemical that mutates 3 animals into giant monsters is a genetic editing experiment initially intended to combat disease, but developed as a biological weapon by Energene, the company that owns it. After a test subject destroys the satellite on which experiments were being conducted, 3 canisters fall to Earth, mutating George, a wolf, and an alligator. As the animals grow larger and more aggressive, and efforts to kill or contain them fail, Energene's CEO uses the antennas on the Willis Tower to transmit a radio signal designed to trigger an enraged response in test subjects, luring the animals into downtown Chicago to destroy evidence of the company's involvement in the crisis. The climax pits Davis and George, whose aggression is cured by an experimental counter-serum, against the other two animals, racing to defeat them before the US military drops a massive ordnance air blast, one of the largest conventional bombs in existence, on Chicago. The plot is largely driven by irresponsible biological weapons research by a corrupt corporation, creating monsters for profit and causing mass destruction as part of a cover-up, while the ticking clock in the third act is, like the 2014 Godzilla, a case of the military nearly writing off a major city in order to destroy the monsters. While Rampage doesn't present these elements as overt political commentary, it still relies on the ideas of untrustworthy private weapons developers and a reckless American military to set up key plot points, indicating a knowledge that such ideas will resonate with and be accepted by the audience. We've established that nearly all of the films in this new American kaiju boom tap into much the same sorts of anxieties about war, nuclear weapons, capitalism, and national identity in light of crisis and the decline of empire that their Japanese predecessors did. But why is this important? Now that we have this knowledge, what can we do with it? To start with, there's been little popular acknowledgement outside of fan circles of this new cycle of films as a coherent phenomenon, let alone serious examination of why it's happening and what it means. Taking these films as part of a larger whole and considering the common ideological threads running through them, if nothing else, contributes to a critical and historical understanding of why modern blockbusters are the way they are. Imagine what a discussion of 20th century American cinema would look like if French critics had never perceived, named, and characterized the phenomenon of film noir amidst the backlog of American films imported after World War II. On top of that, though, it's important to note that this American kaiju revival is still taking place. 2019 and 2020 will see the releases of the 2014 Godzilla's sequels, Godzilla King of the Monsters and the crossover Godzilla vs. Kong, and a, quote, true Cloverfield sequel is reportedly in development as well, following 2016's 10 Cloverfield Lane and 2018's The Cloverfield Paradox, two tenuously related films adapted from initially unrelated projects. There may be more of these films still to come after those, and if there are, they would benefit greatly from both the filmmakers and the audience being conscious of the roots and meanings of the kaiju genre. Films like Cloverfield and Pacific Rim have demonstrated the genre's enormous potential as a medium for commentary on contemporary issues, while Colossal and Kong Skull Island suggest a wide range of possibilities for fusion with other genres and the incorporation of new themes and meanings. American kaiju films still present unexplored territory and unrealized opportunities for innovation, and with a more complete understanding of what's gone before, future films could allow the emerging phenomenon to come into its own as not just a recreation of or tribute to the original Japanese genre, but as a unique cinematic movement unto itself.